Give it a couple. All right, okay. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and get started, as I'm conscious of everybody's time is very valuable. So I'll just start. Welcome to everyone joining us this morning on, as I've just said, on what is a beautiful sunny spring morning. You're all very welcome. Today is the second in a series of 3 webinars hosted by myself here at MCG Investments, with the last one taking place on Tuesday, the 12th of April. More details on that will follow after today's. We'll aim to have our discussion this morning wrapped up within the hour and get you all back to your desks, as I am conscious of everybody's very valuable time and the never-ending to-do lists that you all have to get back to. So we will be recording this webinar for anyone listening in. For anyone that either has to maybe jump off early or hasn't been able to get on this morning, it will be recorded, and that recording will be available on the MCG Investments website from tomorrow onwards. So that should be there. We've had a fantastic response to today's webinar. As I was just saying, as of this morning, we were just short of 120 people registered, which is brilliant, and is clearly a reflection of the 2 excellent panelists we have joining us this morning. So thank you both very, very much for joining us and for giving up your valuable time. I'm very, very grateful to you both. To Jordan, particularly his 3rd year in a row, Jordan, joining us on our webinar. So you're a great supporter of MCG's webinars, and I'm again very grateful to you for that. Before we get started into the discussion, just for anyone listening in who maybe hasn't had the pleasure of either meeting or hearing from both of you beforehand, would you maybe mind just giving our listeners a brief background into yourselves? Jordan, if you want to kind of start just back with who you are, your background, and who you work for and what.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. Thanks very much for the introduction. I can't believe it's the 3rd year in a row you've told me that. It all seems like a big blur, isn't it?
Big blur.
On? But yeah, so my name's Jordan Buchanan. I'm the Chief Economist at PropertyPal, and for those who aren't aware, PropertyPal is the largest listings platform for properties in Northern Ireland. My kind of remit is trying to dig into the data and try and help our collective understanding of what are some of the drivers, from sort of the macroeconomic conditions down to local conditions, and particularly using that sort of granular housing market understanding with the data set that we have there to try and create actionable insights for different stakeholders. So lots of work with government, private developers, and estate agents, and general property professionals across Northern Ireland, and international investors looking to come into the market.
Yeah, my name is Patrick O'Gorman. I'm a developer, and I do predominantly commercial, but also residential development as well. My office and my team are based in London, but I, despite my accent, I do live in Belfast and call Northern Ireland my home, and I'm very passionate about the future of Northern Ireland and Belfast, and what we've got in terms of capabilities for growth that can positively impact everyone.
Excellent. Thank you both very much. That's excellent. As we've been advertising, today's webinar theme is around the outlook in the property market in both the residential and commercial sectors, and what to expect, or what we can expect in 2022. But given what is going on in the world today, that's going to be no mean feat. I've said to my kids recently through discussions that the last 15 years will most definitely be an era that's going to be studied in history classes for generations to come, with the amount of huge impact we've had between the financial crash of 2007, Brexit, of which many businesses are still very much struggling to get to grips with. Then you have a global pandemic, again, which we're all still hopefully seeing a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel on that one. And the world comes to a temporary halt in all business. And now we have the invasion in Ukraine and the huge economic impact that is having across the world. And more importantly, huge humanitarian crisis that it is resulting in, which is absolutely heartbreaking to watch on news every day. So collectively, all of those together certainly makes the job of an economist can't be an easy one, trying to forecast how the economy is going to be impacted with all of that happening. Jordan, And I know you and I briefly had spoke last week in our discussions prior to today, and which we'll discuss now in a second. You guys in PropertyPal have recently released a very comprehensive housing and economic monitor report for spring 2022. And I'm sure since you even started compiling that report, some of the data may have changed already, as it's just such a rapidly changing world that we're living in. So it must make it very, very difficult to forecast. But do you want to just kind of briefly give us your thoughts, actually, before we even go into the report, just on the Ukraine invasion and how you feel that will impact the wider economy globally and then more closely at home here?
Sure. Yeah, no, thanks very much, Tanya. I mean, you're right. First and foremost, it's another humanitarian crisis, so we can't get around the tragedy that is for the families and households around that sort of Eastern European area. So from a macroeconomic perspective, I mean, the immediate impacts haven't really yet been felt across, particularly for the UK and Northern Ireland, I'll be referring to here, in direct economic implications, but they will be coming down the line. I mean, the biggest thing which is going to have the impact on is the rate of inflation in Northern Ireland. Now, inflation, generally speaking, hasn't been a big policy concern for really the last decade or so. It's been pretty low and stable in around sort of the 1% to 2% range, actually almost getting into deflationary territory a few years back. What we've really seen over the past sort of 12 months or so has been starting to see inflation ticking upwards, and it's currently sitting at around sort of 5.5%. And really, the invasion in Ukraine is only going to add to the supply chain disruptions that businesses right across the world are facing in terms of where they get their parts from, but particularly on the commodities market. And we're starting to see, I mean, everyone is experiencing this day in, day out now, you know, the rising oil prices and the impact that's feeding through into the price you pay at the pumps. But the wider pressures then around the UK and by extension Northern Ireland is an energy importer. You know, it imports pretty much its gas and electricity supplies. And as a result of the ongoing tensions across the sort of Eastern European market, that's only going to feed through later in the year into higher inflation. Now, at the minute, as I said, inflation is currently sitting at around 5.5%. The average wage settlement for the median earner at the minute is sitting at around 5%. So in real terms, we're starting to see wages falling, but again, within that, there are different cohorts impacted differently. So the lowest income households, kind of your bottom 10% of earners, have only seen wage growth of around 0.6%. So in real terms, theirs is falling considerably faster than higher earners, which is growing around sort of 6%. So we're starting to see different impacts feeding through to households, but the inflation rate as a whole is forecast. The Bank of England's announcement last week, I'm sure we'll talk on interest rates and the impact that will have as well. Their announcement last week have now suggested they think inflation will hit somewhere between 7, maybe 8% in kind of Q2 to Q3 of this year. So they think it's going to get worse before it gets better. But there's other forecasters, the likes of KPMG, have said inflation is going to hit over 10%. So the truth is the actual household pressures and the impact of rising inflation is going to erode the spending power. It's going to limit the extent of the economic recovery with simply households having less money to spend in goods and services, and it's going to constrain all that spending a wee bit more, which is going to weaken the economic outlook, which will naturally have housing market implications.
Yeah, it's certainly very worrying times, and even you know, like I even know from your report that, you know, your PropertyPal have forecasted interest rates to possibly go, you know, anything from, you know, to 0.75 to up to 1%. But you know, given the increase last week, the chances of further increased rates, I'm sure you'll feel are probably more than likely to happen again. And do you think it'll be, you know, another 2 increases for the end of the year, or possibly more?
Truthfully, it's a wee bit paradoxical, and I would certainly be in the minority of people who would say this, but I was kind of surprised the Bank of England raised interest rates earlier last week to 0.75%. Yeah, so I mean, going into the start of the year, everyone kind of thought, yeah, we're on this sustainable economic recovery, unemployment's quite low, we're seeing strong wage growth. At that point, inflation wasn't sort of a structural concern. So we kind of thought we've got a strong economic recovery coming here. Generally, the sentiment's pretty positive. Now is the time to start raising interest rates. And I certainly at the time would have thought, yeah, maybe 1.25% by the end of 2022. But as I mentioned, that kind of inflationary pressure came in very quickly, and with the latest estimates now of where it's going to go. Now, the paradoxical point of what I'm saying is, ultimately the Bank of England's remit is to raise interest rates to try and curb demand and bring down inflation back to kind of the 2% target. So obviously speaking, it makes sense that they've increased interest rates because inflation is starting to get higher and out of control. But the problem with that is, and as I kind of touched on there, the Bank of England's decision to raise interest rates is only going to really control the kind of domestic demand pattern. So the impact that households and consumers in the UK can spend and ultimately their spending power. These pressures that we're seeing are all on the supply side. The Bank of England changing interest rates is going to have no impact on oil prices or wholesale gas and energy prices. So by raising interest rates, it's going to stem or it's going to weaken domestic demand on top of already weaker demand, which is a result of these international pressures. So it's kind of a double hit in that sense. And the biggest shift that I did note was, I read the minutes of the Bank of England's report there last week, and it did all seem a little bit softer than previous ones. They're very aware that these challenges are outside of their control. So by raising interest rates, it is going to add to those pressures. So my view is now 0.75%. I don't think they're going to go higher than that. If they do, maybe 1%, but I don't think it's going to go any higher than that later in this year, which is lower than I would have said at the start of the year.
Yeah, no doubt they're going to have to sit back and wait and see what happens with energy prices and obviously the impact of the likes of the increase that's coming now in April and see how that is impacted. As you say, that them increasing interest rates is not going to have any impact. They can't control those increases. And just on that, before we move on to the next question, is in relation to the Chancellor's mini budget announcement later this week. Is there anything at all that you think that he might announce in that at all that might impact the economy?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's trying to estimate what the Chancellor's going to say is a very difficult process. I mean, the first thing is the actual financial position or what the amount of money he has to spend is a lot better than he thought he had this time last year. And for complicated reasons, there was revisions to the data, but basically it meant they've spent a lot less than they thought they had back then. So the financial position looks better. So there may be more money there to spend in first instance. But the bigger question is how they choose to spend it, because the different policies they take will impact different households. So I mean, a lot of the narrative going around is we're going to see this big cut in fuel duty coming, which to alleviate the pressures that consumers are facing. And now we've seen governments across the world doing that across Europe, cutting fuel duty to try and stem those price rises to alleviate some of the pressure points that households are facing. But there's different policies there. So I think we will start to see this reduced fuel duty coming through. Who that impacts is really across the spectrum. We've also got the planned rise in the national insurance increase. What is it? 1.5 percentage points from April, or 12% actual rise. And that's clearly going to be a further hit to household spending power. So the timing of that, frankly, couldn't be worse whenever we're starting to see all these pressures coming through already. So it could rescind in that, but largely that's going to be a policy which would help the mid to high income earners. The biggest thing is the minute, as I've kind of said or touched on here, low to mid income households are the ones who are really feeling the financial pressures and squeeze at the minute. So the most obvious solution is a much more targeted and bigger increase in spending and uplift to benefits and general support that the government welfare system provides.
Yeah, I think there will be certainly high expectation and hope that they maybe increase the allowance for the national insurance contributions, and then that way that impact of any increase, which certainly still seems to be quite strong on increasing, at least it won't affect lower income households maybe as much as it will higher income households. So we'll all wait in anticipation to see if that goes ahead. Thank you very much for that, Jordan. Patrick, just following on from that same area of discussion, Bywater are involved in large commercial projects. Are you, as a company, seeing an impact yet on your own projects that you're maybe on site with, or costs that you're projecting for maybe projects that you haven't actually started on site yet, and how are Bywater feeling the increase in rising energy and building costs, supply issues, etc.?
Undoubtedly, yes, we are seeing a significant impact, and I think there's been two major factors when we're doing our financial modelling for any potential appraisal for new acquisitions or existing products. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of inputs that come into the market, into our model. Two of the major ones, the most sensitive ones, are cost of debt, which has gone up, and cost of materials, which has gone up. So the net return is your net return's down, or you've bought it for too much. And if you're looking at buying something new, you can't afford to pay as much for it as you could have a few months ago. So there is a significant difference. Now, I think amazingly, and you look at the housing and commercial markets, amazingly over COVID, they've been remarkably robust. And housing in Northern Ireland, as both of you know, has been extremely strong in the last years, and I'll let you come out with the stats for that. But it's the same across the UK, and it's the same in most of the commercial markets as well. Retail, shopping centres and high street, maybe not, but retail parks, yes. Rents have been strong. Office rents have been strong. In London, the office in retail, the office occupancy market and investment market have been extremely strong, and we're getting record values for sales in terms of London offices. So that has so far compensated the increase in cost of debt and the increase in cost of materials. Now, my concern, and I'm nowhere near as well read as Jordan here, but I might take it as part of my job to read and have as many conversations as possible and read as much as possible to get a view on the inputs. And my concern, as everyone is that the housing market does slow, that the commercial market does slow, and that has an impact on both your financial returns and the cost of you being able to spend for new acquisitions. So that's what we're closely looking at the moment. I should say, in terms of housing in particular, that if you look at the fundamentals of the housing market across the UK and Ireland, we are severely short of stock, and the increase in cost of materials is not going to help that. So there are long-term fundamentals that I think that need to be significantly considered. And there's one graph which I'll never forget, and this was, I think, 2016 graph as we were just coming into Brexit, and CBRE plotted the key political events in the last 2 centuries, and the global economic cycle was only impacted by one, which was World War II. So now, again, that's just second-hand information, but I found it fascinating, actually. And I think it comes back to the long-term fundamentals of both the economic cycle, but the housing market fundamentals as well.
Yeah. And as in terms of you, especially when you say that you do an awful lot of reading and looking into and looking at data, you probably would be looking and studying a lot of the global investors' interest in the UK. How do you see Northern Ireland sitting within the UK now in terms of investors' interest, especially given the rise in costs and issues that we're having? Do you see a favourable interest from investors into Northern Ireland?
I'm a massive campaigner for bringing new investment into Northern Ireland, and it's something I've been doing now for close to 10 years. It's always been more challenging than getting international investment into, for example, England. And it's not because of material costing more, which I don't believe. Materials, I think, cost less and labour is less here, but it's more to do with the political environment, to be frank, and the unknown from an international investor. So I think, sadly, it is harder getting international investment into Northern Ireland. We have a number of our investment partners are from different regions and have invested in the UK alongside myself, but it is difficult. I think in terms of what's going on at the moment, I don't think it makes any, in terms of Ukraine, in terms of global inflation, I don't think that makes a difference to the Northern Ireland specifically. I think the Northern Ireland political environment is constantly challenging, and I think that's something that we should all remain positive about and try and help our politicians stay in Parliament and stay in Stormont and go from there.
Of course, that's certainly a large topic of conversation that I had in our first webinar, and it's constantly one up for discussion, and one that we, as you say, we have to continually support and try to come up with solutions on. We could talk about that one all day, which is an unfortunate situation. But So in terms of the UK itself, then have you seen any changes in investors' interest into the UK? Then in general, in recent, is the investors' appetite still there, or are people now putting a pause on investing in larger development schemes with what is going on around the world, including Bywater?
There has been a slight pause, yes, in terms of just let's see. Now, I think it depends on the property risk. There is billions, trillions of pounds of capital in the world at the moment looking for a home, and so that pressure is not going away. Coming through a lot of the large pension funds and private equity funds that have significant inflows every month. So that pressure to allocate capital is not disappearing. And I think while I am aware of institutional and private investors pausing, all that's doing is going to mean that there's more capital to invest later. So I think generally values have gone up in real estate long term, and I think real estate has become a larger sector of someone's portfolio, either an institutional or an individual's portfolio. And I think that allocation to real estate is actually still growing. So I think there may be a pause, and I am aware of certain investors pausing at the moment, but I think that will be relatively short-lived because the pressures to allocate capital are so strong.
Yeah, so as though it may be a temporary pause, as you say, there's still reasons to be very positive about the potential investment opportunities down the line. And so for anyone listening in who have got land, have got opportunities, that there are still potential investors out there who would want to grab them with both hands, when the time is right.
Significantly, again, there is a lot of money out there looking for homes, looking for investments. I don't see that changing in the short term.
Yeah, well, that's good to know, because we also want to concentrate and focus on the positives as well. We are going through a very challenging period now, but to know that there is still light and there's potential investors out there, if everyone can get the other factors in order. Thank you very much, Patrick. Jordan, I'll jump back to you now and go back to the report that I mentioned briefly at the start. So would you like to give us a summary of the key findings from your report that are, obviously it's specifically related to Northern Ireland and will be very much of interest to people listening in who are interested in the residential property market, whether they're a first-time buyer, second-time buyer, or potentially also anyone interested in the buy-to-let area?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tanya. I mean, it was largely an exercise to try and get all my thoughts on paper from everything that's happened over the last couple of years. It's very difficult to do that in sort of 600-word thought pieces sort of thing in a paper or media article. So I kind of wanted to pull something together a bit more in depth and apply to bring a lot of the more structural information, which I think is obviously lessons from COVID, but it's almost that there's not a huge amount of value in looking back at what's happened. It's more taking the lessons from that to see what that will mean going forward. And I mean, the big thing over the last 2 years, like the housing boom that we've seen in Northern Ireland is not unique to Northern Ireland. This is a feature right across advanced economies in the world, from the UK to Europe to Australasia to the Americas. It really has been a feature across the whole of the globe. And there's so many drivers for what has created that. Now, to focus specifically in the UK market, I mean, ultimately there's been too much cash chasing too few houses in Northern Ireland and the UK over the last 2 years. I mean, the pandemic, the impact that it had, by literally closing swathes of the economy, to close hospitality, retail, to tell people to stay at home, don't pay for childcare, don't pay for commuting costs, and you don't need to go to restaurants, hotels, any of that stuff. What that very simply meant was a lot of households saved a lot more money than they otherwise would have done. And just to back that up in hard data, I mean, I could take the last 100 years of information from the Bank of England savings ratio, which tends to suggest, with a bit of seasonal fluctuation, on average, the aggregate savings in the economy around 6 to 7, 8% of income month to month. During COVID, during 2020, obviously at the peak restrictions, that increased to about 26%. Then with it ebbed and flowed with the restrictions, fell to about 17% thereabouts, and changed as restrictions eased and whatnot. But ultimately that meant over kind of that sort of 12 to 18 months period, the Bank of England themselves and now Treasury have estimated there was an additional £186 billion of accrued deposits and bank accounts over COVID. Now, obviously, the people who were saving that money were not the people who were struggling, who were not the ones struggling to make ends meet. That was the ones who had lots of more disposable income, which couldn't be spent anywhere. So what that very simply meant was you then tell those people, you've got to stay in your house for longer. You've got to make it a classroom. You've got to make it a school. You've got to make it a workplace. That suddenly made everyone think, I need to do this, or I need to do that. I need to extend, or I need to move, or whatever it is. We then also appealed to all our lost talent, if you will, who maybe went to England on job opportunities, who have come back now, seeing the opportunity to get on the housing ladder in Northern Ireland with really good affordability relative to other parts of the UK. Northern Ireland has a lot to offer as a region, but I mean, the sad reality of what I'm trying to say here is one of the biggest drivers of housing markets across the world, but specifically in the UK and Northern Ireland, has been inequality. Because the gap between those sort of mid to high income households has only got bigger to those on the sort of the lower income level. So actually what we find is, the low deposit or the low income households who were trying to save for deposits have actually struggled to grow their savings level over the last couple of years, whereas the mid to high income ones have just really expanded that. So what we've seen is this big shift in property purchases towards more expensive properties, which are largely bigger properties. And that's where we're seeing all the indices saying, prices are rising 5, 6, 10% plus across the UK as a whole. I haven't even talked about, in the middle of that last year, we had the Chancellor announce a stamp duty holiday, which in my view was a terribly timed policy, because all the indicators were already showing that the market activity was rebounding very strongly. And ultimately, that's a policy which is only going to impact those, it's going to disproportionately impact those buying more expensive properties in more expensive areas. Yeah. So what it really created was, again, adding to this inequality piece where, if buyers and sellers are very, very smart and they're guided well in the process. And if suddenly a seller knows that a buyer is potentially saving 5, 10, 15 grand on the sale of a property, that's going to be reflected in the property price as well. So that maybe gets up a wee bit, and it creates this whole rising tide. I mean, there's lots of academic literature over time to show the impact that stamp duty holidays have in terms of changing the profile. Buyers bring forward their sales. If they were thinking about coming to the market, they bring it forward in order to avail of the discount to rush it through, but it then creates price pressures where everything increases. And then after a stamp duty holiday, we tend to have a lull in activity for a couple of months. So basically, a combination of all these factors, ongoing really low interest rates. I mean, we went into COVID with almost no monetary financial firepower, and our central bank interest rates were the lowest they've been in 350 odd years, the Bank of England's independence, which really just creates competitive mortgage deals. So all we saw was this huge boost of demand for property, and that's all being reflected now in the prices. And I guess the question which everyone kind of had was, when is that going to stop? Yeah. So to bring it into today, I mean, I was looking this morning, I would look at it every month. The HMRC announced the sales information for the UK and Northern Ireland. And certainly I don't tend to compare anything to this time last year because it's so distorted because of the result of COVID and the market closure. So basically, if you take the 2 years preceding COVID, so 2018, 2019 as a whole, and then the 2 years sort of since the market reopened in mid-June, the total sales in the pre-COVID period were around sort of 55,000 in that 2 year period. The 2 years since COVID, it's been around 57,000. So we have seen this uplift in activity, but it's not maybe as big as kind of the narrative would suggest that we've had this absolute boom. It's just been a distortion of activity, kind of backdating it to the end of 2020 through 2021. And we're now in the position where everything is starting to settle. So on the PropertyPal data set, I mean, pre-COVID, we would have had 100-ish thousand people a day on the site. During COVID, during the real peak of property interest, we had about 200,000. At the minute, it's sitting at around 140 to 150,000 on a kind of a rolling 7-day average. And that's symptomatic of everything else we're seeing. All activity has settled from peak levels, but it still seems to have set at a higher level than pre-COVID levels. So just the final point I would make, just looking at the sales data, which came out this morning, in January of this year, there were just under 2,000 sales in Northern Ireland, and in February, there were just under 2,300. Those 2 months combined, relative to the January, February, and the period 2015 to 2019, is up around 22%. So actually, sales volumes are still really strong compared to pre-COVID levels. So there's absolutely still a demand feeding through in the market there, but the bit which I haven't talked about, which Patrick touched on, is there just simply isn't enough houses to service the demand at the minute. And that's kind of one of the factors which is going to stay for certainly the next 2, 3, 4 months plus. So whilst we've got the kind of the negative economic factors which are going to weigh on activity, offsetting that, you've got this continued supply demand imbalance, which is going to keep price pressures pushing upwards.
I think that one of the interesting questions will be in terms of mortgages and mortgage applications is the extra cost of living, which every one of us can see every time we go to the petrol pump, or every time we fill up with gas or electricity, whatever it might be. What's the impact on that, on people's ability to spend more on a house? I don't know, Jordan, what do you think about that?
Okay, well, there's a couple of points to that. I mean, the first thing is very few lenders actually factor in cost of living to the affordability. It's very much heavily linked on the income. You know, what's your income, what's your bonus, what's your overtime, all that. That is kind of what drives it. Now, some lenders do go into more detail in terms of your outgoings. I know some lenders locally even ask, you know, how often do you get your hair cut and how much does that cost? And some are really detailed. But the point in principle is, and I know I've spoken to a lot of lenders recently who are trying to look at their affordability metrics to try and factor in the cost of living to it, because I mean, a different argument I would pose is particularly for developers who are building new homes, you know, the average kind of new build EPC, say around B, certainly C or higher, B, some are into the A category. You know, just take a homogenous example, say 1,100 square foot, 3-bed semi of a B rated EPC versus 1,100 3 bed G rated. You know, the average cost of heating in that, say for the new build, would be £500 a year versus £1,000 a year for the G rated. Yeah. Now that should absolutely factor into the affordability from a mortgage purposes. You know, if you're spending £500 less, that's an artificial saving or implied income as a result. That's not currently driving the affordability decision. So that will change, I think, certainly in the coming months, how that will work. But second to that, and the bigger thing coming down the line is the Bank of England are currently consulting at the minute with the view to removing how lenders' affordability is assessed based on what the central bank interest rate is plus sort of 3% range. So to make sure the buyer could afford to repay that should interest rates go up. They're consulting with the view to remove that on the premise that they think interest rates are going to be lower for longer. And rather the bigger metric which protects the financial system is the caps on the loan to income ratio. So how many loans the lender can do on their book where the borrower was taking on more than sort of 4.5 times their income. So that could be a bigger structural change to the financial system later down the year, which could help boost the affordability for some households.
It's interesting, as you know, as building technology improves and buildings become more environmentally friendly, you know, that is, you're right, that's going to have a massive positive impact on disposable income. You know, anyone that does a household budget regularly can see how much money is currently spent on energy of the house and running the house. So I think that's interesting, and we're seeing that actually across all commercial sectors as well. We're designing a timber office building in Westminster in London at the moment, and the energy costs, the timber is lowering the embodied carbon significantly, but it's also operationally extremely low carbon intensive. And the impact on that on the office occupiers' bills is dramatic in terms of the reduction. And now that therefore means technically they can afford to pay more rent, which therefore pays for the extra costs that, you know, that it might cost to do those work. So it does all seem to work its way through one way or another, but we do have a lot of variables at the moment.
That's very interesting. Well, that leads us on to actually, and I will just jump onto that following on from what you're chatting about there, because I know this is a particular area that you're very passionate about yourself, Patrick, and I know Jordan and I spoke about it, is like climate change and the whole global issue around being more sustainable and ensuring that projects design and the development of them are more sustainable. What steps do you, Patrick, feel that other large companies, construction developers need to be adopting in order to get on board more to a green approach to construction that maybe you currently have been looking at? Because I know, as I say, you've looked at this in great detail.
There's been a lot of focus on operational carbon footprint, effectively how much carbon are you using or wasting by running your building, whether it be a house or your office building, your shop, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And I think a large part of that is where you're getting your energy from. And the more renewable our energy sources are, the less of a problem that might be. So I think that's, you know, as our energy system is becoming far more renewable in the UK, I think we're moving quickly towards the right direction on that. The big carbon burp, if you excuse my language there, is when you're building. You know, the amount of energy that's used to make your building materials, to transport your building materials, and obviously, you know, actually potentially take it from the ground as well, is dramatic. So what we're really focused at the moment, and that's what we call your embodied carbon, and that's what we are aiming at the moment, is reducing our embodied carbon. Now, it's difficult to value that, and every time you look at something, it's like, how do we get that value, that cost back in terms of later value? But I think that people, whether that be the office occupier, the shopper, or the house buyer, are becoming far more aware of their role and responsibility in making the world more sustainable. And I think there is a premium, albeit there isn't enough evidence right now to suggest what that premium may be for an eco house, for an eco office, or an eco shop. But we are certainly heading in that direction. And with the buildings that, predominantly office buildings that we've been doing at the moment, where there's been lower operational carbon and certainly lower embodied carbon, the conversations that we're having with occupiers, they're really on top of it. They know exactly what they want, what type of building they want, and how they want to get it. And I think it's our job is to push the people that work in the built environment to make that better, to make, you know, the impact that the built environment has on the world and the climate change less. And at the moment, you know, the built environment represents 40% of the world's carbon footprint. That has to improve. That number has to get lower. And I think it's our job, as all of our people working in the industry, to force that to reduce.
And as you say there, back in that previous example, I mean, it's clear that the cost of using more sustainable products and being greener in your approach to construction, of design and the development, is obviously more costly at the outset, but that then you could potentially recoup some of that so that it nets out more favourable if the end user is willing to pay then a higher purchase price, whether it be for a home or a higher rental income for a retail unit or office, because ultimately their heat costs and energy costs should be lower as a result of a more environmental friendly building that's been constructed. So is it a case that we have to try and get contractors and developers on board with that they may have to wait a little while to recoup back some of the extra costs that it cost them at the outset?
I think
that's mindset.
Yeah, I think there's about education and communication. I think is an important bit of this within the real estate community, but also within the occupational community, the resident or the office occupier. It doesn't have to be more expensive. It depends where you're looking at it. Now, some is, and but some isn't, and I think that's where engineering and design becomes really important. A timber building is not necessarily more expensive than a steel and concrete building. And in fact, I think timber prices have gone up less in the last inflation surge over the last few months than steel and concrete has. So it doesn't have to be more expensive, but I think until we get to that element where it's just part of the designs, right? How do we build this more sustainably? I think there is an element of cost in there. And I think what we need to therefore do is communicate the benefits both to the world, to the planet, and to the climate, but also to the end user's own pocket, that actually running the house is going to be cheaper, running the office is going to be cheaper, which means you might have to pay a little bit more for the upfront. So I think that's a large part is communication.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. It's as you said, it's about educating people and communicating what the potential end benefits are going to be in the longer term. But as you've also said, which is very, very, very true, is that we all have a responsibility to play, and we all are definitely going to have to play that part and educate ourselves more to be adopting more sustainable materials in the build.
And you could
go ahead.
Come in there. Sorry, just a quick comment as well. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said there, but I mean, we kind of lightly touched on the financial impacts there, but for first-time buyers in particular, again, just the data would say that average age 31, and typically second movers are around sort of 38, 39 years old. So 7 to 8 years or so on average in the property. The payback period, if you're saving £300-400 a year as a result of moving to a more energy efficient property at the outset, you may not, if you're a first-time buyer, you may not get that payback over that sort of 7 to 8 year period. So actually, we might start to see more people who are moving towards those who are in later life, or maybe in their forever home, who are actually going to be keen to make that transition quicker, because they will get the absolute benefit of that over the long term from a direct monthly refinancing. So the bigger point I would have is, which at the minute isn't being reflected, which I do think will change. So kind of 2 points. I mean, ultimately, one, technology will drive down the costs of these green products and green technologies being implemented in property. So doing it at the new build and doing that through building regulations is the most obvious one to come into play in Northern Ireland of starting to make that change. But the second point is really around, it's not being reflected at the minute in the capital values. So the same kind of example that I said earlier on, a three bed 1,100 square foot B-rated property versus a 3-bed 1,100 square foot G-rated property does not have a material difference in price. If they're homogeneous, almost exactly the same in the same area, it's not reflected in the property value. That doesn't make sense in my head, how a better, more efficient home cannot be reflected in its value. So I think that's something which will change over time, and ultimately lenders are going to be the ones who play a big role in that change, because the more they're targeting how much of their back book that they're allowed to have with poorly rated or poorly energy efficient properties will then eventually start to be reflected in property values. But that will change over time. It's frankly not there, because it's a much easier conversation to approach financially speaking only. I mean, obviously we know about the health and the economic and the social benefits of warmer and more efficient homes, but purely financially, it's a much easier argument to convince people, if you're going to make this change, one, you'll save X pounds a month relative to what you otherwise would, but your property value is also going to increase by this. So actually the payback period may be recouped much quicker than just looking at it on the monthly savings alone.
Is that also needed, maybe back to Patrick's point about communication and maybe education, even with estate agents as well, and how it's marketed and sold to first-time buyers, like a first-time buyer?
It's absolutely everyone. This isn't one group working in isolation. This is a whole structural trait of a global change, and it's how everyone starts to reflect the value of that property. Right at the minute, it still feels a wee bit, it's the right thing to do. So if you can afford it, you should think about doing it. Whereas that has to change. That this is a goal which everyone can afford to do, and they shouldn't be omitted from getting to an energy efficient house because they can't afford to. If you know what I mean by that.
But as you say, in terms of value in a property, if the EPC rating is higher, then surely that should be reflected in the value of it, and then that's where one property needs to be slightly valued higher to show that difference.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be my view, but I mean that's obviously more of a question for those who are specialists in the built environment and the surveying industry, and whether that is starting to feed through or not. I'm sure like everything, it'll take time to come through. But I mean, there's also government. The government can play a bigger role in this. The behavioural incentive changes. Why could we not be looking at discounted rates bills for energy efficient properties? There's other methods that could be looked at of incentivizing that change for people beyond kind of putting all the onus of responsibility on them to be the one to do it through the wider education.
Yeah. Patrick, did you want to come in on there? I
completely agree with all of it. I think you're right. It does come down to value and being able to explain the value uplift. I do feel that there is a fundamental shift in people's willingness to do something for greater reasons than money, but that takes time. And I think that's a luxury that not everyone has.
No, fair enough. I'm conscious of our time. I just have two other questions that I wanted to put one to both of you. Well, not much as a question, but Patrick, for yourself, we haven't touched on it even, is another widely discussed topic of conversation in recent years is the regeneration of Belfast city centre. Obviously, lots of city centres throughout lots of countries, but for Northern Ireland, the regeneration of Belfast city centre, and it has certainly been even more discussed in the last couple of years, the pandemic. And Bywater are one of those companies who are very heavily involved in contributing to that regeneration through the Smithfield Yard scheme. So I just wanted to see maybe if you'd give us a little summary on that particular scheme for anyone listening who's unfamiliar with it. They shouldn't be. It's certainly been well publicised and looks fantastic. And maybe give us an update on what the current status is with that one.
Yes, certainly. So we just during COVID, we obtained planning permission for 200,000 square foot of mixed use development. is predominantly an office development, albeit what we've tried to recreate is that Smithfield market buzz that I've been told many stories about the life and soul that Smithfield market used to have. I think that area, the inner northwest, as the council are calling it, is already changing quite significantly naturally. There's some great independent businesses there, and I think what we really want to do is provide environment for local businesses to really flourish. And we've created a whole variety of space. So we do have the big office building for the large corporate headquarters, but we've also got this smaller units for the local butchers, the local tradesmen, etc. And we wanted to get that community back in again that Smithfield used to have. So I think what's really important for that part of town, but also the regeneration of Belfast, is mixed use. We need people living in the city centre. We need all sorts of tenures. We need social, affordable, private housing, rental, sale, the whole thing. We need people in the city centre, and that comes working, living, playing. And I think anyone that took a trip into Belfast during COVID, I think would have seen how desperate the situation was there for businesses and the city as a whole. And I think getting people living in the city centre makes a massive difference. And if you look at some of the other cities across the UK and Ireland, even as recent the last 5-10 years, some of the city centre living numbers have increased dramatically in cities like Liverpool and Manchester, Glasgow, for example. And I think we need to follow that system. I think the multiplier impact economically it will have for the greater Belfast population will be significant.
Yeah, and Belfast is such an incredible city. I'm a huge advocate for promoting Belfast as a city, and its popularity throughout Europe has hugely increased in recent years. So it's got so much to offer in terms of skilled labour force, even just the type of people that we all are, and yet it just seems to be missing and lacking in that city centre living. So I absolutely applaud you and think it's absolutely brilliant that you're bringing that type of scheme to Belfast city centre, and wish you all the very best of luck with it. In terms of projected timeframes, do you have an idea as to when you hope?
I've been on several calls this morning already with the council, so we're hoping we'll be on site at the end of this year, next year.
Well, that'll be brilliant. Well, I'm sure everybody listening will certainly look forward to seeing the progress of that scheme. It'll be a fantastic addition to the city centre. Jordan, before one other area of topic that I wanted to touch on, and again it kind of stems out of your report as well, but in general, is actually the rental market. Again, through our discussions last week, you and I were chatting before today, and I was actually quite stunned by some of the stats that you had mentioned to me about the number of inquiries that you're seeing through the PropertyPal website for people looking for rental accommodation. Can you just tell us, for everybody listening, what again those figures roughly were? Because I was quite astounded by it.
Yeah, so again, since COVID, really the rental market has seen a surge in activity. As always tends to be the case during periods of economic uncertainty, we see a rise in demand for the rental market. So really, as soon as pre-COVID, rents were kind of sitting around sort of 2.5–3% thereabouts. And then since COVID hit, almost instantly, they very sharply increased to around sort of 5.5–6%, and have large year on year, that is, and have largely remained at about that level for the last sort of 12 to 18 months. So we're steadily seeing a sort of 6% year on year growth, which, really over the last 2 years, you factor that all in, really means people were paying for 11 months for the price of 12. In some council areas, that's how quickly that changed dynamics. So. The big, I know I've talked a wee bit about the supply demand imbalance across the market, but that is really, really a problem in the rental sector at the minute in Northern Ireland. Now, for instance, kind of pre-COVID, we would have added around sort of depends on the type of lets you look at. If I strip out kind of your non-standard lets and holiday lets and short-term things like that, your kind of standard model one, there's maybe around sort of 16,000–17,000 we put on each year. That has steadily fallen since COVID. Even in the first 6–7 weeks of this year to the middle of March, the total listings of rental properties we've put on PropertyPal relative to this time last year, so just during 2021, has fallen by a further 17%.
Yeah.
So actually, in absolute numbers terms, that means there's about 800 fewer rental properties being put on the market thus far in 2022. But in tandem with that, we've seen an additional 55,000 inquiries for those smaller pool of rental properties. And on a standardized basis, you're talking almost 50 inquiries for every rental property that's put on the market. It's huge numbers, which is just wholly unsustainable. So that's something there's no immediate solution to that other than a mass injection of supply, which I don't know quite where that comes from. Part of that as well is a symptom of strong market conditions. We've seen a lot of smaller landlords, your one person landlords, who are selling up, availing of the strong market conditions. And again, looking at the PropertyPal data, looking at how many all the private rented sector properties that we put on between 2018-19, how many of that unique properties then shifted to the sales market, and it was about 7% of those properties. So that was a sizable cohort just taken out, availing of the stronger market conditions. And then second to that, very commonly cited, is that landlords don't want additional red tape and bureaucracy. Yeah. We've just seen the private rented sector, or the private tenancies bill pass through Stormont at the minute, which is a pretty good bill in my view. It puts tenants at the heart of it, which will hopefully impact some positive change. The second stage of that bill, which is to come in the coming years, I guess, is around, again, going back to it, around EPC legislation. And we've already seen other jurisdictions, your English and Scottish markets, and further on in that journey, where it's pretty much looks like it'll land somewhere that minimum EPCs have to be around sort of C or D level, and by around 2025 with some extensions for existing properties. That's going to be a really significant change to the rental market. I mean, again, on the PropertyPal data set, or just fewer than half of rental properties are below sea level. So that's a huge chunk of properties which are going to need this big investment change to uplift standards, to improve the EPC. That's going to be additional cost to landlords, and ultimately that's either going to be fed through in higher cost of rents, or you're going to see more landlords leave the sector, which is going to exacerbate that supply shortage.
I think one of the solutions to that is the build to rent developments that are undergoing planning at the moment. I think there are a number of schemes that are in planning at the moment for several hundred units within the city centre by institutional developers, investors that have come into Belfast because of the fundamentals shortage you said. I think that's one of the merits of having institutional investors coming in. They're able to design to the right quality. They're able to manage to the right level of quality as well. So I think hopefully that should take away, although that's going to take a couple of years to get up and built.
Yeah, it's one of the cogs, I would say, in it as well. I mean, obviously the build to rent, it's different, targeting different demographics within the private rented sector. So we need an injection of social housing and public and affordable housing. We then need injection of lower cost, relatively speaking, owner occupied housing, and then we also need to build to rent to target the sort of more affluent parts of the private rented sector. So it's a combination of supply injection right across the board.
Yeah, I think we're going to definitely see a huge change in how the whole rental market looks in Northern Ireland in the next coming 5 to 10 years, which is, I think, all right, is very much welcomed. Like in relation to the EPC and landlords with the new private tenancy bill coming in, I think that's a great thing. I think it should only be looked at as a positive. Yes, there will be extra costs for landlords, of which I'm one myself. But at the same time, a bit like back to the sustainable energy element of it, you're going to incur costs to bring the energy rating up. But at the same time, you're going to be adding value to your property. You could possibly increase your rental income to reflect that, because if it's insulated better, the tenants' heating bills, etc., will go down. And we all do as landlords have a responsibility for providing well insulated, heated, high energy rating properties. So I do think in the long term it is a good thing that can come. I also think back again to what we mentioned earlier at the beginning of the conversation about the interest from large investment institutional funds like pension funds coming in for the build to rent type scheme. Again, that's we've got there's a very high demand for rents. You've got people that are institutions that are interested in investing in that type of scheme. So if we could possibly get the planning, wastewater type capacity issues sorted, together collectively in the long term, we can address that gap between supply and demand very much so.
I think John mentioned that. I think we do need a variety of tenures, you know, so private, senior living, social, affordable, and I know the council are working at the moment on their social housing policy, but I think that needs to accommodate a number of different tenures in there as well. It will take time to get that sorted.
It will take time, yeah, absolutely. Okay, I just have one question from one of our listeners, and it is to Patrick, if you're okay for me to ask, Patrick. It's from David Little, and he would like to know what your experience is of the planning process and performance in Northern Ireland compared with GB.
So a bit of background. I think we've had planning applications in Reading, several boroughs in London, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow. I'm sure I'm missing the other countries, other places as well. It's never easy. It's never easy planning in terms of getting planning permission. There's so many different stakeholders that need to be engaged, and several stakeholders internally within a planning body like the council, and externally within the local community. I've had some really good experiences with Belfast Council, and our Boots Donegal Place, I think, was a really good experience. And I've had some slightly slower experiences. I think my biggest concern is just at the moment, I think and I know the individuals are working hard to improve the system, but there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between, you know, the government departments that are organising the planning and the councils, and I think that's something that needs to be rectified. I would say this on a positive note: every single individual I've met within any planning application I've put within Northern Ireland has been positive and has been, you know, trying to do what's best for the city. So I think we've got, you know, the right people there. We need to be brought together, and I think that's the challenge in Belfast. Belfast Council's challenge is to try and bring the departments from the government and the consultees alongside the planning department within Belfast.
And I'm sure, no doubt, there's other different types of challenges with planning in other cities as well. It's not just Belfast with challenges. I'm sure.
Every city has its own challenges, whether that be the local communities, the local demands, or whether it be the planning decision making. Everyone has their challenges. We are under, in this country, a significant amount of pressure in terms of land. That, you know, we have got a huge number of different demands on land, housing, office, commercial. You know, there are lots of factors there, this is not an easy solution. And I think you know, it's a much longer term problem that we need to resolve.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there. I'm conscious now, just coming up on 11:30. Unless there's anything, Patrick and Jordan, is there anything you would like to ask of each other, or anything else you would like to discuss at this point before wrapping up?
I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you both very, very much. I personally find that extremely informative. I think anybody listening in will certainly have taken away quite a number of nuggets. A lot of positive notes there to be hopeful about. Yes, there's an awful lot of negativity out and a lot of hardship and challenges in the wider world, but we also still have to focus on some of the positives that we have here in Northern Ireland, and keep focusing and working away in our own areas for the greater good. So hopefully the world becomes a slightly better place, and we wish the invasion in Ukraine comes to an end very, very soon. So thank you to everybody listening in. As I said earlier, the recording will be available on our website from tomorrow. Our next webinar will take place on Tuesday, the 12th of April, which will be focusing on the social housing sector. And we have Carol McTaggart, Chief Executive of Clonmel Housing Association, and Professor Paddy Gray joining us that day for another, which I'm sure will be another excellent informative discussion. So anyone interested in listening to both Carol and Professor Gray, you do have to register again. You don't automatically be registered from this one. So please jump on to our website. The link is available now to register to that. And on that note, I thank you all and hope you have a great day.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Okay,
Tanya.
thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Take care.
Take care.